Good morning. In this video, we are going to pursue our discussion of the limbic system. In the first part of the video, we focused more on teenagers and how the limbic system in teenagers develops before the prefrontal cortex, and therefore they are more driven by their emotions than by wisdom until the limbic system fully develops. In this second part of the video, we are going to pursue our discussion about the limbic system and about a very important part, which is the hippocampus. We can see here the amygdala and this very small body that appears green on the slide, and there is a horn-shaped structure that arises or that is connected to the amygdala. Actually, they are two. We see only one of them. And these two horns that curve backward from the amygdala constitute the hippocampus. And you can see that the hippocampus is related anteriorly to the hypothalamus and related to the thalamus. So this horn-shaped structure is called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is considered the memory guard because it is responsible for converting short-term memory that you develop on the spot into long-term or remote memory. So if your hippocampus is damaged, then you cannot retain memories. You cannot retain your recent memories and keep them in your brain and convert them into long-term memories that can be retrieved years and years later on. But if you don't have a well-functioning hippocampus, then your recent memories will just fade away, and your older memories that you have developed before injury of the hippocampus are the only ones that will be retained in your brain. The amygdala is another component of the limbic system, and we can say informally that the amygdala is responsible for dark memories. So while the hippocampus is responsible for consolidation of your short memories and converting the short memories into long-term memories, that's to say the hippocampus is responsible for stabilizing a memory trace after you acquire it or after its initial acquisition. Yet the amygdala is crucial for aggressive memories, for memories of fear, for memories of flight, for memories of fright, for memories of aggression. And the amygdala adds these vivid emotions to your memories that are finally stored in your cerebral hemispheres. So the memories are not stored in the amygdala, but the amygdala is responsible for adding those vivid emotions to your memories before their storage. So whenever you have a dark memory, then be sure that the amygdala has played a role in adding those emotions to your memories before their storage in the cerebral hemispheres. And now we're going to talk about an important component of the nervous system, of the pathways, the neural pathways in the nervous system, which is called the reverberating circuits. Why are we discussing the reverberating circuits? Because they are important for consolidation of your memories, for acquiring the memories, for storing them into your memory centers, and for being able to retrieve them later on. A reverberating circuit is a neural circuit in which the nerve impulses that were initially created in response to a stimulus will continuously be reactivated. And this allows retrieval of information whenever needed. We will show the reverberating circuits here. See this diagram where we have an input, we have a neural pathway, and in that neural pathway, we see that the axons are branched and that some of the branches of the neurons of the axons actually make like a U-turn to stimulate other neurons, and those neurons will re-stimulate the first neurons. So you have a stimulus, a trigger that stimulated those neurons, and those neurons transferred the nerve impulses from one of them to the next one or to the following one. And then on their pathway, they gave branches that returned the stimulus to the original first or two neurons. So part of the output is used or utilized to re-stimulate the neurons that started the electrical pathway. These reverberating circuits are said to be very important in consolidation of memory and in retrieving the memory whenever needed. Another important concept related to memory is synaptic plasticity. When there is a connection between two neurons, like here, for example, we have a synapse, this space in between, and here we have the synaptic cleft or the space between two neurons, and the synapse, which is the area where the end of one neuron comes very close to the beginning of another neuron. So there are physical changes that occur in the synapse whenever there is repeated stimulation of the neuron. So synaptic plasticity is the ability of the neurons to make changes in the connections between their neuronal networks in response to use and disuse. So the more you send impulses across this synapse, and the more the neurotransmitters are released from the synaptic vesicles to bind with postsynaptic receptors on postsynaptic neurons, the more you potentiate the synapse. And when you potentiate the synapse, what happens is that the number of neurotransmitter molecules in the vesicles increases, the number of neurotransmitter molecules that cross the synapses increases, and the number of channels that open to allow ions to pass increases. So actually, whenever you repeatedly stimulate a neuron, there are structural changes that occur in the synapse, and we call this potentiation of the synapse or increased synaptic strength, and this is what we call synaptic plasticity. And this is very important, again, in strengthening of the memory. So synaptic plasticity is the ability of the neurons to bring about structural changes in the connections between the neurons in response to use and disuse. And these are structural changes that occur in the neurons upon potentiation. And one practical example from daily life to potentiation is repeated learning. So when you repeat reading, for example, a paragraph or a piece of information several times, you're actually potentiating your synaptic connections. You're actually creating structural changes, tangible structural changes in the synapse, allowing easier transmission of the impulse. Because so the next time you try to retrieve the information, you will find that you retrieve it more rapidly and more easily because you have repeated it several times. And when you have repeated it several times, you have potentiated the structural connection physically. And finally, we're going to talk about the hypothalamus, which is your inside monitor, because we will see that the hypothalamus controls many, many parameters inside your body. And why do we say inside monitor? Because the information comes to the hypothalamus from the inside of the body. So when you feel thirsty, this is because there are certain receptors that sense that there is less water in the body or more salt in the body. When you feel hunger, this is because there are internal stimuli that reach the hypothalamus and tell the hypothalamus that there is a diminution of the level of energy in the body, and so on. So the hypothalamus is called the inside monitor or the inside sensor. It senses thirst, it senses hunger, it senses satiety, sleep, regulation of body temperature. So the hypothalamus senses changes in the core temperature or the inside temperature of the body and regulates it accordingly. It senses like fatigue from muscles, diminished oxygen, increased carbon dioxide, the need for rest. It senses darkness and light around you, and therefore controls your sleep accordingly. It's also, the hypothalamus is also responsible for pleasure and for anger and for regulation of the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is the master gland of the body, the master endocrine gland of the body, because the pituitary gland sends hormones that control the function of other endocrine glands, like releasing factors. But the pituitary gland, the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, is connected to the hypothalamus. And it's a very special connection because the secretions are made in the hypothalamus and are released from the posterior pituitary gland, and we call them neurosecretions. So the hypothalamus receives inputs from this very famous autonomic nerve, the vagus nerve, autonomic nerve number 10, that gives the hypothalamus information about the blood pressure and the gut, the distension of the stomach. Do you have a full stomach? Your stomach is distended, or isn't your stomach distended? So the hypothalamus can have information about your blood pressure. Is it high? Is it low? And about the distension of your stomach through the vagus nerve. From the reticular formation in the brain stem, which is a very important neural network inside the brain stem, I mean inside the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The reticular formation is responsible for arousal, and it is also giving information to the hypothalamus about your skin temperature. And from your optic nerve, the hypothalamus receives information about light and darkness, and this helps the hypothalamus to respond by regulating the secretion of the hormone of sleep, sleep hormone or melatonin hormone. So the hypothalamus has several connections in the body that allow the hypothalamus to gather information about the status of the body concerning the blood pressure, concerning the fullness of the stomach, concerning the skin temperature, concerning the environment, whether it's dark outside or there is sunlight. It also receives information from the olfactory nerve and from the rest of the parts of the limbic system, like the amygdala, and those pieces of information help the hypothalamus regulate eating and sexuality. But the receptor has its own receptors that sense the concentration of salts in the blood, the temperature inside the blood, and it responds accordingly. So the inside of the body is sensed and controlled by the hypothalamus. If you always feel hungry, then you should check your satiety hormone. There is protein called leptin hormone, which is released by the fat cells. When you overeat, the fat cells receive more and more glucose, surplus glucose to store as fat, and the adipose connective tissue or the fat cells start secreting leptin. And this leptin circulates in the blood, and the hypothalamus senses the level or detects the level of leptin in the bloodstream. And when there is too much leptin in the blood, the response of the hypothalamus is to give you the feeling of satiety and to decrease your appetite. There are some people who have a mutation in the gene for leptin, the gene that is translated or expressed into leptin. So in this case, there is miscommunication between the fat tissue or the adipose tissue and the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus cannot know adequately that you have a lot of energy in your body and that you no more need to eat. So if this miscommunication exists between the fat cells and the hypothalamus just because the hormone that should be secreted normally, which is leptin, is a mutated hormone that does not stimulate the hypothalamus adequately, then the hypothalamus wouldn't be respond, and those people have a disturbed appetite. But this doesn't mean that everyone who is obese, for example, has a mutation in the gene for leptin. The limbic system is also responsible for reward seeking. We all love to be appreciated and respected. We all love to be rewarded. And the need for reward or reward seeking is exaggerated and reaches its peak at the time of puberty because it is stimulated by social cues. That's to say, the presence of peers all around and peer pressure makes every person triggered to seek reward and to feel that they need to be accepted, that they need to be appreciated. So this part of your brain that drives you to seek out pleasure and reward, which is the limbic system, is strongly turned on by your friends, by your peers, and by the strong feelings that you have in this period of your life. And this reward seeking and all the related hormones that are secreted from the limbic system are the chemicals that trigger you to do certain actions or that motivate your action. So it all starts by the presence of peers and social interactions. This stimulates you to seek rewards, and this stimulates your limbic system and triggers the circuits of the limbic system, the electric circuits of the limbic system. So the limbic system releases chemicals that motivate you to do certain actions. So seeking reward is important in one aspect, which is that seeking reward is the trigger or the stimulus that drives your actions. Now, when we have a lot of emotional memories, especially if those memories are vivid memories with strong feelings, and especially if those feelings are negative feelings, we call this emotional flooding. And this emotional flooding causes shift of the blood flow and energy away from the prefrontal cortex towards the limbic system and towards the major muscle groups because it activates the sympathetic nervous system. So actually, when you are under stress, even if you have positive emotions, but they make you under stress, or they result in stressing you. So this stress results in what we call emotional flood, meaning that all the blood is shifted away from the prefrontal cortex of wisdom through the sympathetic nervous system to your muscles and to your heart muscles. And this deprives your brain momentarily of oxygen. So your ability of thinking is temporarily shut down. And that's why you should avoid being under stress, and you should avoid um, allowing this stress to make you emotional, whether the emotions are a result of beautiful emotions or bad emotions. In both cases, you're stressed, your sympathetic system is overacting, your heart is beating rapidly, your blood pressure is elevated, the smooth muscles, the arterioles in your cardiovascular system are constricted, your muscles receive more blood, you're tense. So all this drives the blood away from your brain. So we continue, and especially if you have intensely painful events, there are certain hormones that give you intensely painful memories or emotional memories. And these chemicals and neurotransmitter hormones are essentially released from the amygdala. So the intensely painful events result in intensely painful memories that are usually stimulated by the amygdala. And the chemicals help you have emotional memories. These emotional memories are essentially protective. They are not intended to harm you. They are intended to protect you, as we will see later on. So we all have some stress in our lives, and stress or frustration or anger or fear, they overwhelm your brain cortex because they drive the blood and therefore the oxygen away from your brain cortex, especially the prefrontal cortex, and they shut down your ability to think rationally, as we have just said. So when we suffer those intensely painful feelings, the body releases hormones into the bloodstream. Of course, we have adrenaline hormone, we have noradrenaline hormone, we have cortisol, we have other neurotransmitters working in the brain. And this is a part of the flight and fight response. We all know that the fight and flight response is essentially driven by the sympathetic system. So inside the brain, we will have neurotransmitters like adrenaline and noradrenaline, but also in the blood, we will have adrenaline and noradrenaline from the suprarenal medulla. So these hormones give you feelings that have a taste that you know very well. Those feelings that you have when you're angry, when you're anxious, when you are scared. So this is an intensely painful emotional event, and it will become a strong memory with vivid emotions. And of course, it's not only the sympathetic system, but don't forget the role of the amygdala in adding this black touch on your memory. But those very sad and very stressful and very painful moments that like help the development of those black memories and their storage in the brain are very protective to you, because once, if you are exposed to such difficult events and situations once again, you will be very careful not to expose yourself to danger. If you hadn't had those very bad experiences, and if your brain hadn't stored those painful memories, you would be exposed to danger again and again without being able to take the necessary precautions and protect yourself. So are painful memories useful? Yes, painful memories are associated with hormones, with they were created because of hormones. And when you are in the situation once again, in a similar situation once again, the same hormones are released into the blood. They give you the same feelings and they help you recall those memories again. So these hormones tell your body that something potentially painful has just occurred. And here we are talking about the hormones that were released the first time when you first created and consolidated your dark memories. These hormones on that day told you, your body, that something potentially painful just occurred. Dealing with a toxic person, dealing with hatred, with injustice, with whatever. So don't forget this or let this be repeated again. There is something called the stereotypic memories, and it is related to what we have been discussing now. And we call them, we also call them reflex memories. So once again, what are stereotypic memories? Stereotypic memories are memories to which we react constantly in the same way, in a fixed, repetitive, rigid pattern that does not change. And I'm talking about stereotypic memories um, that are emotional memories that become emotional reflexes as we age. What does this mean? This means that when you have a memory that was charged with emotions, especially negative emotions like fright, for example, or extreme fear, that then every time that you are exposed to a similar situation, you will act reflexly and without even thinking or remembering, without even thinking about the previous memory or remembering it. You will act in the same way as you acted the first time. And I'll give you one very simple example. If somebody during when they were young, they experienced a car crash, a very dangerous and severe car crash. So at that time, of course, they had severe emotions and they were in panic and they were extremely frightened by the accident. As time passes, the memory is no more as explicit as before. The memory does not stay as episodic as it was in the past, meaning that they might not remember the day, they might not remember the color of the car, but they do remember the emotions that were associated with the event. So every time they will hear, for example, a sudden car horn, the sound of a car horn or car brakes, they will feel their body will react the same way. For example, their heart would beat very rapidly and they would go into severe panic just like they did on the first time. This is what we mean by an emotional reflex. We mean that you react exactly the same way with the same pattern, and every time you will be found in a similar context or situation, you will do exactly the same. So it becomes an involuntary, as if it were an involuntary reflex that is done repeatedly in the same pattern and in a very rigid way without changing it. These reflex memories or stereotypic memories. Of course, I know that the term stereotypic memories is broader than this, and it's stereotypic memory is not a synonym of emotional reflexes. But what is common between an emotional reflex and a stereotypic memory is the rigid pattern, fixed pattern that is common between the two. So why do we have those emotional reflexes, even if we don't remember the initial trigger or initial sad memory? Because these previous fears or pains were stored in our cerebral hemispheres as painful memories that will be retrieved every time we even when we are not in the same dangerous context, but even when we are near this dangerous context, and the purpose is to protect ourselves and to allow ourselves or help us to protect ourselves from being exposed to danger. And this pain that retrieves the reflex or that triggers the reflex once again might be a pain that we experience again in the present, or a period that or pain that is witnessed by somebody else. So you needn't be yourself exposed to a new painful event or situation to trigger the emotional reflex, but you might witness somebody else experiencing the same pain or the same danger. And these emotional memories will be retrieved, or even when they are not retrieved, you will react in the same way as you reacted the first time. And these initial episodic memories might have been so traumatic and so painful that we might spend the greatest part of our lives acting in a fixed way to avoid reliving them, meaning that you might spend a lot of energy and a lot of effort and a lot of emotional energy to try avoiding or to do maneuvers and reactions to avoid being exposed to the same original situation, because you feel that this situation was so traumatic and so painful that you do not want to relive it once again, and even you do not want anyone else to relive it again. So, and the longer you've acted during your life to avoid being exposed again to those experiences, the more these emotional memories will be translated into emotional reflexes, meaning that the longer you have spent to try to protect yourself against being exposed to the same initial traumatic experience, the more strongly you will react, but every time in the same pattern and in the same rigid way, every time you will be exposed to a bad trigger. And at the moment you react reflexly like this, you no more remember the initial memory, and you no more question why I am doing this and where these reactions come from, but you feel obliged or forced to react in this way as if there were an internal trigger that is forcing you to do this. And this is what we call the pumping action of the painful memories. So once you had an emotional memory in the past, then as time passes, as I've just said, these emotional memories will be converted into emotional reflexes, and they will be converted into defensive mechanisms that are done subconsciously in an involuntary automatic way, in a fixed, rigid pattern, just for one purpose, which is to avoid the pain once again, or to avoid reliving the bad memory once again, like the example of the car crash I've just given, meaning that your heart beats rapidly, maybe your muscles would become tense, your blood pressure would be elevated, just in a trial to escape that situation of a car crash, which is not present, but this is just because you heard a car horn or you heard the car brakes. And over a long period of time, you forget the original memory that becomes no more as explicit as before or episodic as before, and you just have automatic, involuntary, subconscious, spontaneous, stereotypic, strong emotional reactions that are unrelated to the original memory. Why we say unrelated, although they are related? We say this because we want to deliver the message that we react this way even if we don't remember the original memory. And stereotypic means repetitive, fixed, having a fixed pattern, invariable, and maybe also sometimes the term stereotypic may include the fact that your response might be due to a mistaken belief, meaning that you imagine things that are not present, and all this is related to your initial trauma. So what am I supposed to do to stop the pumping? It's true that the pumping is useful to the person because it helps persons avoid being injured once again. But we have to try to stop that pumping. The problem first is that if the pumping, let's imagine what would happen if the pumping continues. If the pumping continues as you grow, these emotional memories will play a significant role in shaping your personality, the way you think, the way you act, of course, because the way you think alters or affects the way you act, and it will shape your emotions in different ways. And the problem is that, as I've said and repeated several times, all these changes in your personalities occur in a subconscious manner, although the initial trigger might already have been forgotten. So the problem is that we have lost sight of the original event that provoked and stimulated the secretion of these hormones of the bad memories like adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol, and all the work that is done by the amygdala and the limbic system in the first place. And when counseling, the role of the psychiatrist or the psychologist is to try to restore this connection between the present personality, the present way of thinking, the present way of acting, the present feelings, and the initial trigger that occurred in the past. Because in such a way, you can relieve the original emotion when you open up and when you unload your psyche from these initial triggers that were the reason behind all these changes that shaped your personality. You are stopping the process of pumping that is done subconsciously from the past to the present, and you might find improvements in the way you react, even when you are exposed to similar situations in the present. So there are certain very simple maneuvers to deal with sad memories and overcome a traumatic experience. First of all, have a busy life, because when you are busy, you are less concerned with minor details. And therefore, even if a toxic person or an aggressive person tries to harm you, maybe you wouldn't have time to think about them. You are too busy to think about these minor problems. The second important thing is to avoid objects and places that trigger the memory. Um, and this is what many people do. For example, when they have a previous car accident, they stop driving the car. Or if you dealt with a toxic person in the past who caused you all these pains, you might stop dealing with that person. And you try to substitute, meaning that the more you charge your brain with happy memories and rewards And the more you activate this reward system in your body and make your brain secrete a lot of serotonin that raises up the mood, that lifts up the mood, or dopamine, the hormone of reward, or oxytocin, which is the hormone of love, then the more you like unload these bad memories or negatively charged memories from your cerebral hemispheres. The fourth maneuver is distraction, meaning that every time you feel that you are focused on a sad event, on a sad event in your life, distract yourself from that sad event. Every time you have been on a very toxic discussion, try to distract your brain and try to do something that you love, to go for an outing with friends whom you love, etc. The fifth maneuver that is very important is opening up. And sometimes when we don't have anybody around to open up with, you can just talk to yourself. You can just write your thoughts on a sheet of paper and tell yourself that you're going to like put it in the bin after finishing, because sometimes we are too scared to write our ideas and our thoughts, fearing that somebody else would read them. Um, and part of the distraction is focusing on happier memories. And that's why you should build up a storage of happy memories in your brain. So every time you find yourself inclined to sadness and to the bad memories, try to distract yourself and focus on the happier memories. Always have hope. There are short-term hopes, there are long-term hopes. Always have a hope, even if it's a minor hope, because this hope will trigger the reward system in your body, in your limbic system, and will drive you to start acting positively. Of course, make your health a priority for many reasons, because when you're healthy, you become independent. You need, sometimes there are toxic persons and you're forced to deal with those toxic persons just because you're too weak to be self-dependent. So make your health a priority for another reason, which is when you're healthy, when you're physically healthy, you will be mentally healthy. You will feel proud of yourself, of your potentials. And this is very important, especially as you grow older. This point of learning to be in the present is very important, because um, learning to be in the present means that you understand very well that the past has gone and you cannot retrieve the past and you cannot return to the past to make it better. And the future, you don't know yet what would happen in the future, but you know that the present is your bridge to the future. So try improving or ameliorating your present in order to have a greater potential of having a greater future. And most importantly, when you remember a negative event, instead of drowning in that negative event, on the contrary, try to learn the lessons from that event. Every obstacle, every failure is a stepping stone to success. Thank you. And if you liked this video, click on like, share it with your friends and colleagues, write a comment, because your comments are very important to me and your feedback is very important, and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you and see you on another video.